Hello, everyone. I hope you're feeling well and having a peaceful day. Today, we're going to explore a powerful story where one man risks his career, his family's approval, and everything he once had just to protect the woman and child he loves. When love stands against tradition and pride, what is the true cost of choosing your heart? Stay with us until the end to find out. And if you enjoy deep, emotional stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. In the late afternoon light pouring through tall office windows in a foreign city, James sat perfectly still. He used to be the man who held everything together, the one everyone waited on for decisions. Now, he was just a man gripping his phone like it was the last thread tying him to the life he once knew. On the other end of the line, his father's voice was cold, firm, and unmoving. There was no warmth left in it. The words came down like a sentence already decided. James was no longer part of the company. Not because of failure, not because of incompetence, but because he had chosen to love a woman who had once been married and who already had a child. Honor of the family. Those words were repeated again and again, sharp and heavy, cutting deeper every time they landed. James tried to speak, tried to slow the moment down. His voice trembled, but it didn't break. He talked about Nye, the small girl with bright eyes and a gentle heart. He talked about Diep, about the love they shared, about how real it was. He spoke about change, about how the world wasn't the same anymore, how old judgments shouldn't define a new generation. But his father didn't listen. He cut James off mid-sentence, his tone like hardened steel. "I only care about honor. I will not accept this." That was it. No discussion. No space for explanation. In that instant, James felt something inside him split open. It wasn't just the loss of a position or a title. It was the loss of acknowledgement from the man he had admired his entire life. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the air itself had turned against him. Outside, traffic hummed through the city streets, distant and uncaring. Inside, everything was silent. The call ended. James slowly lowered the phone, his hands shaking despite his effort to stay composed. For the first time, he truly understood something he had only heard about before. Love can cost a man everything. Even the throne he once believed was firmly his. A heavy realization settled over him, dark and unavoidable. He didn't regret choosing Diep, not for a second. What hurt was the distance it carved between him and his father, a wound that felt too deep for time to ever fully heal. Back in rural Vietnam, beneath the wide wooden roof of the family factory, the air was thick with heat, resin, and sawdust. Workers stood in loose lines, voices low, faces tense. A shipment had just arrived, 30 tons of wood, enough to keep things running for the month. But after what everyone quietly referred to as John's incident, many employees had left. Some quit without notice. Others simply never came back. The company was losing people fast, like water leaking from cracks no one could seal. Reports were delivered one after another. Suggestions followed quickly, almost desperately. Raise wages, reduce hours, offer bonuses, anything to stop the bleeding. The manager listened, his expression growing darker by the second. He nodded, asked for details, ordered a full plan. But deep down, he knew the truth. These were only temporary fixes. The heart of the place was gone. Once, this factory had been the family's pride. Now it stood unsteady, lacking not just workers, but direction. Eyes met across the room, full of shared concern. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. James leaving wasn't just a leadership change. It was like removing the soul from the building itself. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. Tall stacks of lumber stood quietly, reminders of better days. Machines still ran, but the sound they made felt hollow, uneven, like a heartbeat struggling to keep pace. The factory seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a collapse no one wanted to acknowledge, yet no one knew how to prevent. Across the city, under the yellow glow of streetlights, rainwater reflected passing headlights on a crowded avenue. Two men stumbled forward, pretending to be drunk. They fell hard onto the wet pavement, drawing brief attention. In the confusion, a quick hand slipped into a passerby's pocket and came back out with a small roll of cash. A few million. Not much, but enough. "That's it?" One of them laughed quietly. "Enough for another round." They clapped each other on the back and disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a man patting his pockets in confusion. No one stopped. No one chased them. The moment passed as quickly as it came. Somewhere nearby, an ambulance siren wailed. Someone had mistaken the fall for an accident. But it was only a performance. The city kept moving, indifferent as always. In moments like that, morality feels thin. When survival becomes the priority, the line between right and wrong fades fast. The two men vanished into the noise, their laughter blending into the city's rhythm. Honest workers walked past, unaware that another small theft had just added one more quiet scar to the street. Meanwhile, inside a small agricultural warehouse, fluorescent lights flickered softly overhead. A woman everyone called Madam sat down, calm but serious, and asked to see the books. An employee stood before her, head lowered, explaining the numbers. Average revenue, seasonal imports, potatoes, ginger, grapefruit. Everything sounded normal, almost routine. Then she asked the real question. Where has the young master been? Why hasn't he checked the accounts in so long? No one answered right away. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. James, once the driving force behind everything here, had become just a name people spoke less and less. Madam flipped through the ledgers, a trace of sadness crossing her face. The warehouse still functioned. Orders still went out. But without James, it all felt hollow. Outside, machines hummed steadily, but their rhythm felt tired, like something slowly losing strength. She closed the book and said quietly, "When he comes back, tell him to review these again." The words hung in the air, uncertain, an instruction, or a hope. As she stood and walked toward the door, her shadow stretched long across the concrete floor. Beyond it, stacks of produce rose high, yet no one spoke of Boss James anymore. That silence cut deeper than anger ever could. It was proof he was being erased, slowly but surely, from the very place he had built. Later, in a cramped meeting room washed in harsh neon light, expense reports were scattered across the table. James sat stiffly, his voice low but firm as he demanded explanations. The Tan Minh Bridge project, the construction site, budgeted at $3 billion, already past 4.1. The number hit him hard. The employee tried to explain. The bridge foundation was only partially complete. The other structure was nearly finished, but costs had exploded. Materials, labor, delays. Everything had added up faster than expected. James listened, jaw tight. He insisted on transparency at every step. No more rough estimates. No more guesswork. Even a small rural company couldn't survive like that anymore. If we don't control every stage, he said quietly, we collapse. Those weren't just instructions. They were fear, spoken out loud. Fear of losing the last things he still had control over. His eyes drifted toward the window, out to fields glowing under the late afternoon sun. Once, he had decided everything. Now, all he saw were red numbers. The room fell silent, filled only with the sound of paper shifting and hearts racing. Shadows crept along the walls, matching the shadow of failure, slowly overtaking what had once been his world. In that moment, James felt it clearly. Not just financial loss, but the unraveling of who he was. Slanted afternoon light cut through the open workshop door, illuminating dust and sawdust floating in the air like fragments of memory. James stood near the center of the space, reviewing notes that no longer seemed to matter when an employee approached him. The man hesitated, then spoke, his voice trembling despite his effort to stay respectful. From now on, he said quietly, we take orders only from the chairman. Your father instructed us. No one is to follow directions from Boss James anymore. The words landed with brutal clarity. There was no anger in them, no drama, just a simple statement of fact. And somehow, that made them hurt even more. James didn't react right away. His face remained calm, almost empty, but inside him, something collapsed completely. This wasn't a warning. It wasn't temporary. It was final. He had built this place step by step. He had earned trust, loyalty, authority, and now, with a single command from his father, all of it was gone. No explanation, no conversation, just removal. The air in the workshop felt foreign all of a sudden. The sound of machines in the distance no longer felt familiar. They belonged to another world now, one where James had no place. He looked at the employee, pain flashing briefly in his eyes before settling into something colder, quieter. When I finish settling my family matters, James said softly, we'll talk again. They both knew it was only a polite ending to a conversation that had already ended for good. There was nothing left to discuss. James turned and walked away. His shadow stretched long across the concrete floor, thin and lonely. Each step echoed, heavy and hollow, like footsteps through a space that no longer recognized him. For the first time, he felt the full weight of it. Not just losing the company, but losing his position as a son in his father's eyes. Losing himself inside the very system he had helped build. Outside, dusk settled over the factory grounds. The sky burned red along the horizon, the color of something ending whether one was ready or not. Lights flickered on one by one inside the buildings, indifferent witnesses to a man who had risked everything for love and lost the throne he never truly owned. Regret didn't come as tears. It arrived as emptiness. A deep, quiet hollow where pride, power, and certainty had once lived. That same afternoon, the local market buzzed with familiar noise. Vendors called out prices. Children laughed as school let out. Scooters weaved through narrow paths. Life moved forward, unaware of the private collapses happening elsewhere. Diep sat beside her basket of fresh okra, hands moving quickly and skillfully. She selected the best pods, weighed them carefully, passed them to customers with a warm smile. Business was steady. Nai sat close by, calm and patient, watching her mother with wide, trusting eyes. Diep bought a bottle of water and a hot sausage, handing it to her daughter. Are you thirsty, Nai? she asked gently. Drink slowly, okay? Nye nodded, smiling, completely unaware of the quiet worry hiding behind her mother's eyes. Diep smiled back, but as soon as she turned away, her gaze drifted to her phone. She hesitated, then dialed. The ringing felt longer than usual. 1 ring, 2, 3. Then the cold, mechanical voice answered, "The subscriber you have called is temporarily unavailable." Diep lowered the phone, her heart tightening. She watched Nye take a bite of the sausage, crumbs falling onto her shirt, her face innocent and content. For a moment, Diep just watched her, fighting the weight rising in her chest. The market noise continued around them. Voices, footsteps, bargaining. But inside Diep, everything felt strangely quiet. She kept selling. She kept smiling. Her hands didn't stop moving, but her thoughts drifted, pulled toward James. She knew what he had given up. She knew the cost of choosing her and Nye, and that knowledge scared her more than she ever admitted out loud. Questions pressed in from every side. Was he okay? Where was he now? Had everything finally become too much? As the sun lowered, golden light spilled across the market, catching on the okra in her basket, making it glow. It reminded her of something she had learned long ago. Life could be harsh, but it also demanded endurance. You didn't always get answers right away. Sometimes, all you could do was keep going. When the crowd thinned, Diep packed up her things. She took Nye's hand, feeling the small fingers curl tightly around her own. Together, they walked home along the familiar road, their shadows stretching ahead of them in the fading light. Her steps were steady. Inside, they were anything but. That unanswered call stayed with her, hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. It held both hope and fear at the same time. Around them, vendors closed their stalls, lights turned on in nearby houses. The day quietly came to an end. But Diep carried her own storm. Love, tested by distance, by silence, by the painful uncertainty of whether the man she loved was still holding on to the promise they once made under a different sky. Night settled in gently. Somewhere far away, James stood alone with the consequences of his choice. Somewhere closer, Diep tucked Nye into bed, brushing her hair back, whispering soft reassurances she herself wasn't sure she believed yet. 2 lives moved forward in parallel, connected by love, separated by circumstance. Neither knew what tomorrow would bring, but both understood one thing clearly now. When love challenges tradition, power, and pride, survival itself becomes an act of courage. And in the quiet spaces between unanswered calls and fading authority, that courage was the only thing either of them had left